collision over Rio. On the morning of June 14, 2026, a helicopter carrying 32-year-old American musician, filmmaker, and internet personality Oliver Tree lifted off over Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. It never reached its destination. Oliver Tree had built one of the more unusual careers in modern music. He was an alt-pop artist known for absurdist visuals, deliberately provocative persona, and a fan base that had grown steadily through a combination of viral content and genuinely unconventional releases. He was also a filmmaker and a figure who operated across multiple creative disciplines simultaneously. At 32, he was at a point in his career where his public presence was larger than it had ever been. Rio de Janeiro is one of the most helicopter-dense cities on the planet. The city's geography, a sprawling coastal metropolis hemmed in by mountains, ocean, and chronic road congestion, makes ground travel through certain neighborhoods an exercise in hours-long delays. For the city's affluent residents and visiting professionals, helicopters serve as a functional alternative to the gridlock below. On any given morning, multiple aircraft operate across the same corridors, navigating the same coastal airspace with a regularity that has become part of the city's rhythm. Recreio dos Bandeirantes sits in the western coastal zone of Rio. It is a neighborhood of wide avenues and commercial activity bordered by lagoons and the Atlantic. On June 14, 2026, helicopter traffic over the area was moving as it typically did, multiple aircraft sharing the same low-altitude routes that funneled affluent travelers across the city. Tree was one of 4 passengers aboard a helicopter that morning. Also aboard were Argentine influencer Gaspar Prim and filmmaker Lucas Vignale, along with others whose full details had not been publicly confirmed at the time of early reporting. A second helicopter was operating in the same airspace. The 2 aircraft collided in midair over Recreio dos Bandeirantes. The collision was not survivable. Both helicopters lost structural integrity immediately. They fell from the sky together, 2 disabled aircraft dropping toward the streets below. They came down in the parking lot of an electric vehicle dealership. The impact was catastrophic. The force of 2 helicopters striking the ground in close succession, along with the fuel both aircraft were carrying, triggered a massive fire. The flames spread through the parking lot rapidly, consuming dozens of vehicles in the dealership's inventory. The fire burned visibly and drew emergency response from multiple directions. Firefighters and emergency personnel arrived at the scene to find both aircraft destroyed and the surrounding lot engulfed. The scale of the fire complicated initial access. Vehicles continued to burn as responders worked to contain the blaze and assess the crash site. All 6 people across both aircraft were dead. The recovery of the victims took place amid the fire suppression effort. The dealership's parking lot had been reduced to a field of burned metal. 6 people had been aboard the 2 helicopters. None survived. Early investigation focused on human error as the primary cause. Authorities noted the density of helicopter traffic operating over Rio's coastal neighborhoods and the regularity with which multiple aircraft share the same routes and altitudes. The precise sequence of events leading to the mid-air contact had not been fully determined at the time the investigation was opened, but the conditions that made such a collision possible, high traffic volume and shared corridors with limited separation protocols, were identified as central to the inquiry. Oliver Tree was pronounced dead at the scene. He was 32 years old. Gaspar Prim and Lucas Vignale were also confirmed among the 6 fatalities. The investigation into the collision remained open. Fog over Calabasas. On the morning of January 26, 2020, a Sikorsky S-76B helicopter departed from a private facility in the Los Angeles area carrying 9 people. Among them were NBA legend Kobe Bryant and his 13-year-old daughter Gianna. None of them would survive the flight. Kobe Bryant had spent 20 years playing for the Los Angeles Lakers. He had won 5 NBA championships, 2 Olympic gold medals, and an Academy Award for a short film he produced after retirement. He had been one of the most recognizable athletes on the planet for the better part of 3 decades. After retiring from professional basketball in 2016, he had shifted his focus towards storytelling, business, and youth sports. The Mamba Sports Academy was part of that post-playing identity, a facility he had built to develop young athletes, and the tournament scheduled that morning was exactly the kind of event he had made central to his life after the NBA. Gianna Bryant was 13. She played basketball. She had been identified by her father publicly as a serious player with real ability, and she was traveling with him that morning not as a passenger, but as a participant in the tournament the helicopter was heading toward. The other 7 passengers included fellow parents, coaches, and other young players connected to the Academy program. Southern California in late January can produce marine layer conditions that settle over the hills and canyons west of Los Angeles. On the morning of the 26th, the fog was dense. Visibility in the Calabasas area, a community set into the Santa Monica Mountains northwest of the city, had dropped significantly. The Los Angeles Police Department had grounded its own helicopter fleet that morning due to the conditions. The weather was not suitable for visual flight. The Sikorsky S-76B lifted off regardless. The pilot had extensive experience and had flown Bryant on numerous prior occasions. The route from the departure point to the Mamba Sports Academy required crossing terrain, elevated hills, and canyon ridges that rise sharply in that part of Los Angeles County. Shortly into the flight, the helicopter entered the fog bank. Spatial disorientation is a phenomenon in which a pilot loses reliable sensory reference to the horizon and to the aircraft's actual position relative to the ground. The inner ear and the body's balance system, which pilots rely on instinctively, can generate false signals under instrument conditions, telling the pilot the aircraft is level or climbing when it is not. Without visual reference to the horizon, and without correct interpretation of flight instruments, a pilot can enter a descending or banking trajectory while perceiving themselves to be flying straight. The pilot of the Sikorsky S-76B entered that state. Believing the aircraft was climbing out of the fog, the pilot instead initiated a steep, high-speed banking turn. The helicopter rolled and descended. It was moving at approximately 184 miles per hour when it struck the hillside in Calabasas. The impact obliterated the aircraft. The hillside terrain was steep and covered in brush. There was no runway, no flat surface, no margin. At 184 miles per hour into a hill, the helicopter simply ceased to exist as a structure. No distress call had been made. First responders reached the crash site after navigating the terrain on foot and by emergency vehicle. The fog that had contributed to the crash was still present. The hillside was steep and the debris field was severe. What they found when they reached the site confirmed immediately that there were no survivors. The aircraft had not merely crashed, it had been destroyed on impact. Los Angeles County Fire Department personnel worked the scene in difficult visibility conditions. The terrain required careful approach. The wreckage was spread across the hillside. 9 people had been aboard. 9 people were dead. The National Transportation Safety Board launched a formal investigation. Investigators reconstruct the flight path using recorded data and determined that spatial disorientation was the cause. The aircraft had been equipped with no terrain awareness and warning system, a technology that would have detected the proximity of the hillside and generated an alert to the cockpit, regardless of visibility conditions. TAWS had been available. It had not been required on that class of commercial helicopter. In the aftermath, advocacy groups and aviation safety organizations renewed calls for mandatory TAWS installation on commercial helicopter operations. The absence of that system on the aircraft that killed Kobe Bryant, Gianna Bryant, and 7 others became a reference point in the ongoing argument for the regulation. All 9 aboard were pronounced dead at the scene. Cause of death was blunt force trauma sustained in the high-speed hillside impact. Blades on set. On July 23, 1982, at a location called Indian Dunes in California, a film production crew was shooting a scene for Twilight Zone, the movie in the early hours of the morning. By the time filming stopped that night, 3 people were dead, and the history of how movies were made in America would be permanently altered. Vic Morrow was 53 years old. He was a veteran character actor, with a career stretching back to the 1950s, best known for his long-running role in the television series Combat. He was not a star in the marquee sense, but he was a working actor of significant experience and professional standing. When he signed on for Twilight Zone, the movie, he was one of several respected actors attached to an ambitious anthology film being produced by some of the most commercially successful directors in Hollywood. The film was being directed in segments. John Landis, who had directed Animal House and The Blues Brothers, was responsible for the segment that brought the production to Indian Dunes that night. The scene required Morrow to carry 2 children through a simulated wartime environment, running through water, surrounded by explosions, with a military helicopter flying low overhead. The children in the scene were Micah Din Lay, age 7, and Renee Shin Yi-chin, age 6. Both had been hired for the production in violation of California child labor laws. They were not supposed to be on set that night. They were not supposed to be working at all under those conditions. Their presence on the production had been concealed from the relevant oversight authorities. The shoot was scheduled for the late hours of the night. Indian Dunes was a privately owned outdoor location, used regularly by film productions for its open terrain and its distance from residential areas. The set for the scene included a water-filled structure designed to simulate a Vietnamese village under attack. Pyrotechnic charges had been placed throughout the area. The Bell UH-1 Iroquois helicopter, a Vietnam-era military aircraft, was to fly at extremely low altitude over the actors while the explosions detonated around them. Landis ordered the helicopter to descend to approximately 24 feet above the ground, directly above the actors. The pyrotechnic charges began detonating. One of the explosions was catastrophic in a way the production had not anticipated. The detonation sent debris and force into the helicopter's tail section. The tail rotor, which controls directional stability and prevents the helicopter's fuselage from spinning freely in response to the main rotor's torque, was disabled by the blast. When a helicopter loses its tail rotor, it loses the ability to maintain controlled flight. The aircraft begins to rotate uncontrollably around its own axis. At 24 feet above the ground, with no altitude to allow for recovery, the result was immediate. The Bell UH-1 spun out of control and fell directly onto the actors below. Morrow and both children were struck by the aircraft as it came down. The rotor blades in the body of the helicopter made contact with all three of them in the impact zone. They were killed at the scene. The film crew witnessed the crash from their positions around the set. Cameras had been running. The disaster was recorded on multiple angles. Emergency services were called immediately to Indian Dunes. Responders arrived to find 3 people dead and the production in chaos. The illegal presence of the children on set became apparent in the immediate aftermath. The concealment of their employment from authorities and the circumstances under which they had been placed in proximity to low-flying aircraft and live explosives became central to the investigation that followed. The Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office filed criminal charges. John Landis and 4 others connected to the production were charged with involuntary manslaughter. The case went to trial and attracted enormous attention from both the film industry and the public. After extended legal proceedings, Landis and the co-defendants were acquitted. The acquittal did not end the consequences. The Twilight Zone accident drove a fundamental and permanent overhaul of safety regulations governing film and television production in the United States. The rules governing the use of aircraft near performers, the proximity of pyrotechnics to human beings, and the enforcement of child labor protections on film sets were all revised. Industry safety oversight bodies were restructured. The changes were not incremental. They were wholesale. Vic Morrow, Micah Dinlay, and Renee Shin Yi Chen were killed at Indian Dunes on July 23, 1982. Midnight slope impact. In the early hours of August 27, 1990, a Bell 206B helicopter departed from the Alpine Valley Music Theater in Elkhorn, Wisconsin, carrying 5 people. Minutes after liftoff, it was gone. Stevie Ray Vaughan was 35 years old. He had spent the better part of 15 years building a reputation as one of the most gifted blues guitarists alive. His 1983 debut album, Texas Flood, had arrived with an authority that felt immediate and fully formed. He played with a physicality and an emotional directness that set him apart from virtually everyone else working in the genre. By the late 1980s, he had also confronted and overcome serious personal problems with substances, and those who knew him and those who followed his career closely regarded his recovery as a second chapter, a musician who had come through something and returned to the work with even greater focus. The show at Alpine Valley Music Theater on the evening of August 26, 1990, was the kind of event that marked a career milestone. Vaughan shared the bill with Eric Clapton and Buddy Guy. The 3 of them had performed together over the course of the night, and by the time the final notes landed, the audience had witnessed something that people who attended would describe for the rest of their lives. Alpine Valley was a large outdoor music venue in southeastern Wisconsin, set into a landscape that included ski facilities built into the hillside adjacent to the site. The venue drew enormous crowds, and after a major show, the roads out of the area became heavily congested for hours. For performers and their entourages, commercial helicopters offered a practical exit, lifting out of the site and heading toward Chicago or other destinations before the traffic locked everything down. Vaughan boarded one of several Bell 206B helicopters arranged to carry musicians and crew members out of Alpine Valley that night. The flight was bound for Chicago. It was past midnight. The conditions were not good. A dense, low-hanging fog had settled over the area, reducing visibility significantly. The helicopter lifted off. Almost immediately after liftoff, the aircraft entered the fog bank. The pilot was navigating through near-zero visibility in an area of terrain that presented a serious hazard. Directly adjacent to the Alpine Valley venue, rising sharply from the surrounding landscape, was a ski hill approximately 300 feet in height. In clear conditions, it would have been visible from any point of departure. In the fog that covered the area that night, it was invisible. The helicopter flew directly toward the hill. The aircraft struck the side of the slope a few thousand feet from the point of liftoff. The impact was immediate and complete. At the speed and angle of approach, there was no structural survival possible. All 5 people on board were killed. The wreckage came to rest on the hillside of the ski facility adjacent to the venue. The crash site was not distant. It was close enough that the departure and the impact occupied only a brief span of time. Emergency responders were called and made their way to the hillside. The terrain and the continuing fog complicated access. When they reached the wreckage, 5 people were dead. The investigation that followed examined the flight conditions, the departure decision, and the terrain surrounding the venue. The proximity of the ski hill to the helicopter departure area and the fog conditions present at the time of liftoff were central to the findings. The pilot had lifted off into conditions that did not allow for safe visual navigation of the local terrain. Stevie Ray Vaughan was pronounced dead at the crash site. He was 35 years old. 4 other people aboard the helicopter also died. The music world registered his death as one of the most significant losses the blues had absorbed in a generation, spinning over Leicester. On October 27, 2018, a helicopter lifted off from the center of King Power Stadium in Leicester, England, in front of thousands of people. Less than a minute later, it was burning in a concrete parking lot outside the stadium walls. Vichai Srivaddhanaprabha had owned Leicester City Football Club since 2010. His acquisition of the club had been viewed initially with cautious optimism by supporters, but over the years that followed, the relationship between the Thai billionaire and the Leicester fan base had grown into something that extended well beyond the standard owner-supporter dynamic. He was visible at matches. He was accessible in ways that owners of major football clubs rarely are. He paid for drinks for supporters. He ran giveaways. When Leicester City won the Premier League title in 2015 to 2016, a result so improbable that bookmakers had placed the odds at 5,000 to 1 against it at the start of the season, Srivaddhanaprabha's ownership was regarded as central to the conditions that made it possible. He had a routine after home matches. His Augusta Westland AW169 helicopter would be positioned on the pitch at King Power Stadium, and after the final whistle, he would make his way to it and lift off from the center circle, departing directly over the stadium roof. Supporters had come to recognize the sight of his helicopter rising over the stands as a regular part of the matchday experience. On October 27, 2018, Leicester had drawn 1-1 with West Ham United. Tens of thousands of supporters were filing out of King Power Stadium as Srivaddhanaprabha walked to his helicopter and boarded. The Augusta Westland AW169 was a modern twin-engine aircraft. It lifted off from the center circle and climbed normally, clearing the stadium roof. Then it began to spin. The rotation was not gradual. The helicopter began turning violently and without control. Witnesses in the streets around the stadium and supporters still in the area could see it immediately. The aircraft was not flying. It was falling, rotating on its axis, the tail whipping around in a way that made the cause unmistakable to anyone who understood what they were seeing. A pin in the tail rotor mechanism had disconnected. The tail rotor is responsible for counteracting the torque generated by the main rotor blades and giving the pilot directional control. Without it functioning correctly, the helicopter cannot be steered. When the pin disconnected, the tail rotor lost effectiveness and the aircraft began to rotate freely. From the point of failure to impact, the aircraft fell into the concrete parking lot immediately adjacent to King Power Stadium. The crash was witnessed by large numbers of people. Supporters who had just exited through the stadium gates were in the surrounding streets. Emergency services were called from multiple locations simultaneously. The helicopter had come down in a public area with significant foot traffic following the match. The aircraft exploded into flames on impact. The fire was immediate and intense. Emergency services, including fire crews, police, and paramedics, arrived at the scene within minutes. The proximity of the crash to the stadium meant the area around the wreckage was already populated when responders arrived. The fire made access to the aircraft extremely difficult in the initial response period. Firefighters worked to bring the blaze under control, while paramedics assessed the situation around the perimeter of the crash site. All 5 people on board were confirmed dead. The fire had been severe, and the impact had been unsurvivable. The investigation identified the disconnected tail rotor pin as the mechanical cause of the loss of control. The specific failure point was confirmed and documented in the official findings. Vichai Srivaddhanaprabha was pronounced dead at the scene. He was 61 years old. Mountain Fog, Iran. On May 19, 2024, a convoy of 3 helicopters was flying through the mountainous Varzakhan region of northwestern Iran. 2 of them landed safely. The third did not. Ibrahim Raisi had been president of Iran since 2021. He was one of the most senior figures in the Iranian political structure, a man whose position placed him at the center of the country's domestic governance and its international posture. Hossein Amir Abdullahian, the country's foreign minister, was also aboard the 3rd helicopter. Several security officials accompanied them. The Varzakhan region is remote. It sits in the mountainous northwestern corner of Iran, a landscape of steep ridgelines, dense forest, and weather patterns that can shift rapidly and without significant warning. The terrain is not forgiving to aircraft that lose visual reference. The valleys are narrow, the forest cover is thick. In poor visibility, the margin between safe navigation and a collision with terrain is measured in seconds. The convoy was flying through conditions that were deteriorating. Fog had settled over the mountain range. The other 2 helicopters in the convoy navigated through and reached their destination. Abdullahian. The Bell 212 carrying Raisi and Amir Abdullahian did not. The aircraft flew into the side of a densely forested mountain under zero visibility conditions. When the other two helicopters arrived at the destination without the third, the alarm was raised. The aircraft carrying the president of Iran had not arrived and was not responding. Search and rescue operations were launched immediately, but the conditions in the Varzakhan Mountains on the night of May 19th presented serious obstacles to any rapid response. Freezing rain had settled over the region. The fog that had brought down the helicopter was still present and still dense. The terrain was steep and heavily wooded. Navigation by rescuers on the ground required moving through forest in near darkness, in freezing conditions, with severely limited visibility. Helicopter search operations were constrained by the same fog that had caused the crash. More than 12 hours passed before rescue crews located the wreckage. When they reached it, they found the aircraft completely incinerated. The impact and the resulting fire had consumed the helicopter entirely. There was no possibility that anyone had survived. The condition of the wreckage confirmed that the crash had been unsurvivable at the point of impact. Ibrahim Raisi, president of Iran, and Hossein Amir Abdullahian, the country's foreign minister, were confirmed dead, along with the other passengers and crew aboard the Bell 212. The cause was impact with mountainous terrain under zero visibility fog conditions in the Varzakhan region. Into Lago Ranco. On February 6, 2024, former Chilean President Sebastián Piñera took off in a helicopter over Lago Ranco in southern Chile during a storm. 3 of the 4 people on board survived. Piñera was not among them. Piñera had served 2 non-consecutive terms as president of Chile, from 2010 to 2014, and again from 2018 to 2022. Before entering politics, he had built a substantial business career and accumulated significant personal wealth. He was also a licensed pilot with real experience, a fact that was not incidental to the events of February 6th. He was not simply a passenger that afternoon. He was at the controls. Lago Ranco is a lake in the Los Rios region of southern Chile, a resort area known for its natural landscape and its appeal to the country's wealthier families as a vacation destination. Piñera was there on holiday, spending time with family and close friends. He had shared a lunch with a group that included his sister and several others before deciding to take the Robinson R-44 Raven II helicopter out over the lake. The weather was bad. A heavy storm was moving through the area, bringing intense rain and the kind of low visibility that makes flight in a small helicopter genuinely hazardous. The Robinson R-44 Raven II is a light 4-seat aircraft, widely used for private aviation, but not equipped with the redundant systems and instrument packages of larger commercial helicopters. Piñera took off anyway. Shortly after departure, the conditions inside the cockpit became untenable. The windshield fogged up completely, eliminating Piñera's visual reference to the world outside the aircraft. He could not see the water below him. He could not see the shoreline. He could not see anything. The helicopter lost control a few hundred yards from the shore and plunged into the lake. It capsized on impact. Before the final moments, Piñera spoke to the other passengers. His sister, who survived, later reported his words directly. He told them, "You jump first, because if I jump with you, the helicopter will fall on all of us." The 3 other occupants, Piñera's sister, a friend, and the friend's son, escaped from the sinking cabin and swam to safety. They reached shore alive. Piñera did not surface. The impact had left him unconscious or unable to free himself from his harness. He could not exit the aircraft as it sank. Rescue operations were launched as soon as the alarm was raised by the survivors. Divers were deployed into Lago Ranco to search for the aircraft and for Piñera. The water at the crash location was deep. The helicopter had gone down in approximately 92 feet of water. By the time divers reached the wreckage at depth, Piñera had drowned. He was still in the aircraft. He had not been able to escape before the helicopter settled at the bottom of the lake. Sebastián Piñera was pronounced dead. He was 74 years old. Cause of death was drowning following the crash of the Robinson R-44 Raven II into Lago Ranco on February 6, 2024. Champion down Lanark. On September 15, 2007, a helicopter crashed into a wooded area approximately 1 mile from a private estate in Lanark, Scotland. 4 people were killed. Among them was one of the most celebrated rally drivers in the history of the sport and his 5-year-old son. Colin McRae won the World Rally Championship in 1995. He was the first British driver to win the title, and he did it in a way that matched the personality he had built over a career defined by speed, aggression, and a willingness to push machinery to limits that other drivers respected from a distance. His driving style was spectacular and occasionally terrifying, and it made him one of the most popular figures in motorsport across multiple decades. It also gave his name to a video game franchise that introduced his career to millions of people who had never watched a rally stage in their lives. After his peak years in top-level rallying, McRae continued to compete and remained deeply connected to the world of motorsport. He lived on a family estate estate in Lanark in the Scottish lowlands, and by September of 2007 he had been a private helicopter pilot for some years. The Eurocopter AS-355B2 Squirrel he was flying that day was his own aircraft. The morning of September 15th was a local flight. The destination was close. McRae was flying within a mile or so of his own property, in terrain he would have known from the air on multiple previous occasions. 2 family friends were aboard with him, as was his son Johnny, who was 5 years old. McRae flew the aircraft at high speed and low altitude through a narrow wooded valley near the estate. He entered a turning maneuver. The aircraft clipped the tree line. At the speed McRae was flying and at the altitude he was maintaining, contact with the trees was not survivable. The helicopter came apart as it struck the canopy and went into the ground. All 4 people on board were killed. Emergency services responded to the crash site near Lanark. The wreckage was in a wooded area, and the recovery operation required working through the trees. 4 people were found dead. The Air Accidents Investigation Branch conducted a formal investigation into the crash. Inspectors examined the aircraft itself and found no mechanical faults. The Eurocopter AS-350B2s had been functioning correctly at the time of the accident. The failure was not in the machine. Investigators determined that McRae had been flying at high speed and low altitude through a confined wooded valley. The aggressive turning maneuver he executed had either caused him to misjudge his clearance from the tree line, or he had experienced spatial disorientation, losing accurate perception of his position relative to the terrain. The investigation also produced a finding that had not been widely known before the crash. McRae's pilot's license had expired. His official helicopter type rating, the qualification specific to the aircraft he was flying, had also lapsed. He had been flying without a current license and without a current type rating. The flight on September 15, 2007 was illegal under aviation regulations. Colin McRae was 39 years old. His son Johnny was 5. Both were pronounced dead at the scene, along with the 2 family friends aboard the aircraft. Short of runway. On September 8, 2017, a helicopter went down into a wooded area near the Flying W Airport in Medford, New Jersey. The crash killed 2 people, including one of the most recognizable names in American country music. Troy Gentry was one half of Montgomery Gentry, a duo that had built a substantial career in country music through the late 1990s and into the 2000s. The group had scored a long series of charting singles and had maintained a loyal following through consistent touring. On September 8, 2017, Gentry was at the Flying W Airport for a scheduled concert performance that evening. The show was hours away. The Flying W Airport is a small general aviation facility in Medford, a community in the Pine Barrens region of southern New Jersey. It hosted events alongside its aviation operations, and the concert that evening was one of a series of performances the venue ran through the warmer months. Gentry had arrived well ahead of the show, as performers typically do, to accommodate soundcheck, logistics, and the various preparations that precede a live concert. At some point before the concert, Gentry was offered the opportunity to take a flight. It was not a planned or necessary trip. It was a pleasure flight, a brief time in the air to take in the view of the venue and its surroundings from above. He boarded the Schweitzer 269C helicopter with the pilot. They lifted off. The Schweitzer 269C is a light piston-powered helicopter used commonly for training and private operations. It is a small aircraft, and like all aircraft, its performance depends on the condition of its components. Shortly after takeoff, something failed. The throttle tie rod, a component of the engine control system responsible for allowing the pilot to regulate engine RPM, detached. The tie rod had not been properly maintained. When it came free, the pilot lost the ability to control the engine's power output. RPM management was gone. Facing a loss of engine control and no ability to restore it through normal means, the pilot made a decision. He shut the engine off entirely and initiated an auto-rotation. Auto-rotation is a procedure that allows a helicopter to descend and land without engine power. When the engine is disengaged, the rotor continues to spin due to the airflow generated by the descent itself. A pilot who executes the maneuver correctly can use that stored rotor energy to flare the aircraft just before touchdown, slowing the descent enough to land with manageable force. It is a genuine emergency procedure, and it requires precise timing and execution. The pilot began the auto-rotation a quarter to a half mile too early. The aircraft was not positioned over the runway or any suitable landing surface. The early initiation of the maneuver meant the helicopter was descending toward terrain that offered no safe arrival point. As the aircraft bled off forward speed and rotor momentum, the physics of the situation became unrecoverable. The helicopter entered a steep, near-vertical descent. It came down into a wooded area adjacent to the airport, short of the runway by the distance that the early auto-rotation initiation had removed from the equation. The impact with the trees and the ground crushed the cabin. The pilot was killed instantly. Gentry was found alive, but with severe injuries. He was extracted from the wreckage and transported to a nearby hospital. He died from his injuries shortly after arriving at the hospital. The investigation identified the improperly maintained throttle tie rod as the initiating cause of the sequence. The component had detached because it had not been correctly serviced. The mechanical failure was preventable. The subsequent auto-rotation, initiated too far from the runway, had eliminated any possibility of reaching safe ground. Troy Gentry was pronounced dead at the hospital on September 8, 2017. He was 50 years old. The concert scheduled for that evening did not take place. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.